What is up my fellow techies? In this video I'll be showing you how you can transform your DualSense controller into this stunning showpiece. This is a complete DualSense shell replacement from Extreme Rate, who were kind enough to send it over for me to check out. This video isn't sponsored, so any of the opinions I express are my own. I'm going to show you how to disassemble the DualSense controller and replace the shell with this awesome two-tone design. Before I show you the disassembly process, I'll quickly mention what tools you'll need. The replacement shell will arrive with all of the tools necessary to pry open the controller. We have a plastic prying tool and a Phillips 00 screwdriver to remove all of the screws. You may also want to invest in a magnetic ball to keep hold of the screws, but additional ones are provided by Extreme Rate. Keep a flathead screwdriver handy too for the hard to reach internal clips. Start off disassembly by using the plastic pry tool to take off the front faceplate. I like to start off on one side and gently pry up the faceplate. This then creates a larger gap on the other side of the faceplate at the bottom, making it easier to lift up. Apply a tiny bit of force to release the faceplate, taking care not to bend it too much so as to not break the tabs at the top. This will reveal two screws at the bottom of the controller. Before we take those out, it's a good idea to remove the L1 and R1 trigger buttons. What you want to do in this instance is press down on the L2 and R2 buttons and gently lift up the buttons using the plastic pry tool. You'll hear a distinctive click as they come loose. Keep a finger pressed down on the top of the buttons as they tend to fly out if you're not careful. Remove the two screws at the bottom of the controller and the two at the top. Put the screws in your magnetic tray for safekeeping. To release the two parts of the shell, start pulling it apart from the bottom. Wedge your finger in the space between the two parts and lift the tab at the front using the plastic pry tool. Move on to the other side and do the same thing, wedging a finger in the gap and releasing the tab at the front. The two parts won't fully separate until you release the tabs at the top of the controller on both sides. This is where the flathead screwdriver will come in handy. Once the gap between the shells is uniform across the whole of the controller, you can quite easily take the back off. Pressing down on the triggers while you're taking it off will help release the two parts more easily. Battery removal can be done by hand, but if you have a pair of needle nose pliers, you'll find this bit easier. What I did in this scenario was to lift the connector slowly on each side to gently disconnect it. You don't want to pull it out using the wires, as this may cause damage. Now that we have the battery out, we can remove the screw for the battery holder. With that out of the way, we can disconnect the various ribbon cables. Each cable has a hard bit of plastic you can use to pull the cables out. You don't want to pull on the ribbon cables themselves, as you'll risk breaking them. Whilst pulling using the plastic tabs, it helps to wiggle the cable a little bit while you're disconnecting them. Take out the two ribbon cables on the left and right and the one for the mic at the bottom. The hardest ribbon cable to take out by hand was the one for the touchpad at the top with the blue tab. The trick here is to pull it out from the corners, alternating corners as you're pulling. Now we want to remove the two screws that are securing the hardware onto the front shell. These are not the only screws, so don't try taking off the front shell just yet. To get to the other two screws securing the hardware to the front shell, you'll need to push on the metal tabs at the top of the PCB and at the same time push the hardware up using the joysticks. This will lift up the PCB to reveal the two silver screws you'll need to remove. These screws are longer and they can't, or rather shouldn't, be used elsewhere. Place the PCB back into position, as it'll be easier to lift off the front part of the shell this way. Start removing the hardware by lifting from the bottom and it should all come apart quite easily. Remove the options and share buttons at the top. The ribbon cable for the mic can be gently removed. You want to angle the connector at the bottom while you're pulling the cable out from the top, and it'll pass through the gap and out without too much fuss. Remove the two screws from the touchpad plate to release the touchpad. Remove the rubber padding at the bottom of the remaining buttons and take them out. We have the PlayStation button, the D-pad and the action buttons. Finally, remove the mute button at the bottom. It's important at this point to remove the dampening rubber for the action buttons. Use the plastic pry tool to lift it up from the corners. I nearly finished replacing the shell when I noticed that there was some rattle, particularly on the action button side. This was all because I forgot to take out this additional piece of rubber. Now take out the frame that holds the touchpad in place, push down at the bottom of the frame and it'll just pop out. You can slightly push up the top part of the shell to help with this. You'll also want to remove the black accents that exist on the inner portion of the joystick holes. These will release without too much force. They may end up flying out, so keep an eye out in case you lose them. This bit was the most stressful for me as it involved removing a semi-permanent fixture. The PCB for the touchpad is glued onto the touchpad plate. I had a heat gun handy, but you can use a hairdryer for this portion if you don't have one. The one I'm using is fairly inexpensive and it's a useful investment for projects like these. Before we actually apply heat to the PCB, it's a good idea to stick down the PCB using some masking or frog tape. I found that my fingers got quite hot on my initial attempt to apply heat to it and I couldn't do it for very long. This way you won't have your fingers in the way and the touchpad plate won't lift up. Apply heat in 30-second intervals and slowly pry up the PCB using the plastic tool. After each pass with the heat gun, it'll be easier to lift up the PCB. Start from one corner and make your way to the other side. Apply a bit of force but not too much, as you may end up bending the PCB beyond repair. In hindsight, I should have applied a bit more heat as some of the adhesive didn't come off with the PCB. There was also a slight bend on one side, so I was a little worried the touchpad may not work. While the adhesive is still warm and sticky, you want to transfer it over to the replacement touchpad plate. There is a small section on either side of the touchpad plate to hold the PCB in place. Stick around to see if the touchpad still works once I put everything back together. Start by placing the D-pad into the appropriate area. There's a tab at the bottom of the button set that indicates the orientation. Slot the D-pad with the tab at the bottom into the front shell. Press on the rubber backing to secure them. Add the dampening rubber with the arrow facing up to the action button section. Place the triangle button at the top with the larger tab facing down. Place the X button at the bottom with the larger tab facing up. Place the square button on the right, pointing towards the touchpad with the larger tab facing left. Place the circle button in the last slot with the larger tab facing right. Finish off with the rubber backing. The orientation for this doesn't matter. Add the PlayStation button and the rubber backing with the two holes on the rubber backing located at the top. Press in the mute button to finish off. Before you push in the ribbon cable for the microphone, it's a good idea to remove the mute button as it makes it very difficult to get the ribbon cable through. The protruding gold piece of the microphone should be facing downwards into the slot at the front of the shell. With that in mind, you can slot the ribbon cable through the hole by angling it very slightly. Now add the rubber casing with the hole facing the top. Re-add the mute button before you forget. The black joystick accents can be pressed in from the top. They'll click into place without any pressure. With the indent in the touchpad plate facing upwards, slot it in from the bottom like so. Place the black touchpad insert into the frame with the flat part of the insert at the back. Slot the ribbon cable through the hole and screw into place. Re-add the share and option buttons with the stem for each facing the touchpad. You can't interchange these, so you won't run into problems when slotting these back in. Now that we have all of the buttons in place, we can finally get the meat of the controller in. As you're placing everything back in, make sure you pull out the ribbon cable for the mic, as it'll have a tendency to get stuck between the meat and the front shell. Before we slot in all of the ribbon cables, we want to lift up the PCB again by pushing into the tabs and the joystick buttons from the bottom. Use the silver screws we took out at the beginning and secure the hardware to the shell. Slot in the ribbon cable at the top. Make sure you are pretty firm on this part as you may run into problems when it's all put back together. Secure the one on the right and then the one on the left. Finish off this portion by connecting the ribbon cable for the microphone. Add the battery plate back onto the back of the PCB with the flat portion at the bottom and screw it in. Slot the microphone into the compartment on the battery plate and add the final 2 screws to secure the hardware. The final housekeeping step involves slotting the mic into the compartment at the front. Just as a precaution, you might want to turn on the controller and check if all of the buttons and features are working as expected. I first checked the joysticks, they were absolutely fine. No issues with the D-pad either. The options and share buttons were working as expected. To test the triggers and the touchpad, I loaded up the Astro's Playroom demo as it goes through all of the controller features. The rumble was perfect. The touchpad worked flawlessly and this was the bit I was most worried about. The triggers were resistive too, so I was extremely happy with my efforts. After testing the controller out for a bit and I was confident I hadn't broken anything, I began the process of putting on the back shell. You want to angle the shell such that both shells align at the top. Once you've achieved the correct alignment, it's a simple matter of popping the 2 pieces together. You should hear a super satisfying click as the pieces are pressed together. Screw the pieces together starting from the bottom of the controller. Next, you want to drive the final 2 screws in behind the triggers you removed at the beginning. This is where I run into a slight problem in that the holes for the screws didn't fully align and so it was really difficult getting the screws all the way in. Pop on the L1 and R1 triggers, just line them up and press on them to get them back on, easy peasy. To finish off the replacement, slide the faceplate on. The hooks at the top should slide into the provided cavities and you shouldn't have to force it back on. Click the faceplate into position and you're done. I used the controller for a couple of hours after replacing the shell and I had 0 issues. It's machined really well and it'll be easier to clean since dirt won't get trapped on the smooth finish. It's definitely not as grippy as the original shell, but I can live with that given how iridescent and eye-catching it looks. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, a like would be appreciated. If you're still here, I'm going to guess you enjoyed the video, so why not subscribe? I'm open to covering any tech item out there, so suggestions are welcome in the comments. See you in the next one.